Continuing on with structure and function of living things, the last 2 days we have looked at the cell size. We use the potato cubes and the iodine to look at surface area versus volume of a cell, and how surface area and volume are actually limiting factors for the cell size. Surface area equals the rate of material, how much and how fast it enters and exits the cell through the cell membrane, and then the volume is the rate of material being used or being made. So if one of those changes, you have kind of a disruption in the rate of things coming in and out of the cell, or how much or how often those materials are being used and at what speed. As the volume of a cell grows, so does the surface area. Obviously, when you blow air into a balloon, obviously you're expanding the balloon, and therefore you're having more surface area, thus minimizing the surface to area to volume ratio, which we saw with the potato lab. If the ratio gets too small, then the substance won't be able to enter the cell fast enough to fuel the reactions, and the waste products won't be excreted fast enough. So this is why cells are microscopic. If we had a cell the size of the kitchen table, we wouldn't be able to get the nutrients or the materials to the middle of the cell fast enough, and then we wouldn't be able to get waste out fast enough because it would take too long to get from the middle of the cell to the exit of the cell. So moving on from surface area and volume, there are some things that all cells have in common other than their size. We have hundreds of different cells, plant cells, animal cells, bacteria cells, hair cells, heart cells, eye cells, all different kinds of cells. But they all have these same four things. They all have a plasma membrane, which decides what enters and leaves the cells. Usually they are a phospholipid membrane. Okay, we talked a little bit about this when we touched on lipids. They all have ribosomes, which make protein. They have the DNA, the genetic information, which codes for the proteins. And then they are all filled with a semi-fluid gel inside, which is a cytoplasm, which kind of holds everything together. There are two different types of cells. We have eukaryotic, which is very like you and me. They're animal and plant cells. They are usually make up multicellular organisms, and they are very complex. As you can see, they have Golgi bodies and lysosomes and mitochondria and ribosomes, cytoplasm, the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, where if you look over at the prokaryotic cells, or prokaryotes, they usually make up single-celled animals, or organisms, and they are much simpler. You can see they have the cytoplasm and the ribosomes, but they don't have a lot of the other organelles. We talked about this a little bit earlier also with the Prezi presentation, that yes, all cells have those four things, but also that all living things carry out these 7 functions. They include unicellular organisms, so anything the size of an amoeba all the way to the size of a whale, all the cells that are making up the whale and all the cells and the cell that makes up the amoeba are going through these 4 things: metabolism, response, homeostasis, growth, reproduction, nutrition, and defense. And if you want to learn more about that, you can check out the video for characteristics of life. Move on to that, yes, all cells are the same in some function, but they are not all the same. Okay? Genes and DNA control the growth and development of cells, which enables cells to be a little bit different. We start off with, if you look at the picture, you know the smallest particle is an atom. We put atoms together, we get molecules. Then we get our macromolecules, which we talked about. Macromolecules make the organelles, and cells to tissue, to organ, to systems, to the organism. Okay? So if we break you down, you know you have a digestive system, a respiratory system, circulatory system, all like that. Okay? But how do we get, from being a one-celled organism when sperm met egg to having specific cells, specific to, digestion, breathing, circulatory system, stuff like that? Well, cells become specialized or differentiated by gene expression. Yes, each cell of you has the same information, the same genes, but what happens is some of those genes are turned on and some are not. Okay, so with the genes turned on, they code for certain proteins, which then show the structure and function of that specific cell. There'll be a video, the next slide, that will talk a little bit more about it. Production of cell specialization in structure and function. Cells are organized into tissue and organs into a specific arrangement. Like I said, if we move on to the next cell, this is an IB guides, so interbaccalaureate, but she does a very great job of telling what is going on.
Let's take a look at cell differentiation. We know that multicellular organisms are made up of many different types of cells. We've got, for example, hair cells, eye cells, skin cells, bone cells, and let's take the last one, heart cells. And the question is, how do these cells become different from each other? The important thing to remember is that multicellular organisms contain many genes, and every single cell in this multicellular organism contains all the genes of that organism. Let's say I could represent all the genes of this organism using the cross. So this cross represents all the genes of this entire organism. And remember that genes encode for proteins, and proteins affect function and structure of cells. And so if we take 3 different cells from the same organism, let's say an eye cell, a heart cell, and a hair cell. Each cell will contain all the genes of that organism. And so let's say this organism had 10 genes. Each one of these cells would have the 10 genes. What is important though is that not all of these genes will be activated. So let's say in our first cell, gene 2 and gene 3 are activated. In our second cell, gene 4 and gene 6 are activated. And in our last cell, gene 1 and gene 5 are activated. This means our first cell will encode for proteins 2 and 3. Proteins 2 and 3 will affect the structure and function of the cell, and so this cell will become an eye cell. If we look at a heart cell, gene 4 and gene 6 are activated, which will lead to proteins 4 and 6. Proteins 4 and 6 will affect the structure and function of the cell, and this will lead to a heart cell. And finally, in our last cell, gene 1 and gene 5 will code for protein 1 and 5. Proteins 1 and 5 will affect the structure and function of the cell, and so this cell will become a hair cell. And so remember, it is the expression of certain genes which allow cells to develop in different ways. This is called cell differentiation. Let's take a real-life example which you can use in your exams. Keratin is a protein that is found in hair and it affects the structure of hair. And so remember that each one of our cells contains the keratin gene, but not all of our cells will express this gene. In our eye cell, the keratin gene will not be expressed, and so our eye cell will not produce the protein keratin. Same goes for our heart cell. Even though our heart cell has the keratin gene, it will not be expressed. So once again, this cell will not produce keratin. In our hair cell, on the other hand, their keratin gene will be expressed. And so this cell will produce keratin. And this keratin protein will affect the function and structure of this cell. And so the important thing to remember is that all the cells in a specific organism contain all the genes of that organism. However, not all of them will be expressed. Gene expression is regulated during transcription, and it is the expression of certain genes which allows cells to differentiate. And so this means that multicellular organisms have a huge advantage compared to unicellular organisms. The unicellular organism has to carry out all of its functions within this one cell. A multicellular organism, on the other hand, has cells that can differentiate, and this means that these cells can specialize according to their function. This is what makes a multicellular organism so efficient.